I'm gonna play some songs about grandparents, okay? Now, Grandma's a person who everyone likes. She bought you a train and a bright, shiny bike. But lately she hasn't been coming to dinner. And last time you saw her, she looked so much thinner. Now, your mom and your dad said she moved to Peru. But the truth is she died, and someday you will too. La 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 la.
Why do we take the scraps of connection offered to us as kids and warp it? Usually this is achieved by showing what happens behind the scenes. The mascot's head comes off, the sweet-voiced Miss Frizzle lady starts cursing, or we are shown a day in the life of the man behind the mask. This type of humor began as an urban legend about the 40s children's radio host Uncle Don, and developed into the focused identity of anti-Barney humor. Poor Barney is the biggest scapegoat for the overestimation of the power of innocence. These shows never promised us anything. They were just designed to engage with children. It's the adults in hindsight that misinterpreted and over-romanticized their role. It's neglected adults who conflate nostalgia with betrayal when the deeper meanings and ideals they project onto other things don't translate to their real life. It has its roots in boomers, it sprouted with Gen X, and flowered the most with millennials. Millennials grew up more or less believing everything bad was in the past, and the future could only get better. They grew up believing in a clear morality, safety and stability, meaning and purpose, and connection with community. They were promised a world of bottomless opportunities, stability, and progress, only to face some of the worst and most consistently devastating economic upheavals in American history: student debt, privileged access to basic health care, and existential threats such as the irreversible effects of climate change, the worth of the human body, and the cost of public vulnerability. Where justice should be clear, we chase moral ambiguity. A lack of preparation has left us unstable. Simple effort is resented, so disconnections are enabled and ties are severed. Nepotism has become the only offer of purpose or guarantee of success. Personal meanings and accomplishments are diminished through comparison. People resent simplicity as they face complexities and generate more neglect. What's sad to me is the fact that these parodies, while they can be pushed to be grotesque and repulsive, are still created with the fondness for that innocence. Creating a coping mechanism for the corruption of that idealized innocence can give people a sense of agency or control over mourning the future they envisioned, so young in age. I feel like a lot of millennials try to reclaim power in rejection, but have ultimately shot themselves in the foot. Coping mechanisms are not a lifestyle. There is a longing for connection that people seem to be so scared of, they can barely touch it. There's a lot of examples I can think of, and noticing how many there are and how popular they are is what motivated me to make this video. What's interesting is that a parody doesn't necessarily have to be funny, and that leads me to the crux of this video. The strongest and most cohesive example of a children's TV show parody is Kidding. Kidding is some of Jim Carrey's best work. After he worked on The Truman Show, Jim Carrey seemed to be unable to deny his self-awareness any longer. Over time, he went through a personality cultivation and likely sees himself as a student of Bob Weir and Mr. Rogers, and like most Duncan Trussell types, seems to be karmically doomed to recognize himself as an eternal disciple of a spotless mind. The struggle against himself will always exist. In Kidding, Jim plays Jeff Picarillo, otherwise known as Mr. Pickles. Kidding is based off of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but has BoJack Horseman-esque storytelling. Jeff acts like an innocent man, believes he is synchronous with his inner child. We see how a man like that reacts in emotionally fraught situations outside of his network TV show. His son has passed, leaving him to wonder how well he can perform for the rest of the kids that make up his audience. His wife leaves him, and he has to decide what love really looks like and how to teach that to his audience. As a direct parallel, we see his sister Deirdre go through her own version of the same hell. The show is about aging creatives trying to process reality, facing adult emotions with a very unprepared mind. The series begins with one of the exact scenarios I described before, behind the scenes of the Conan show, where Mr. Pickles is about to guest on. Right away, there's a breaking of the fourth wall. We as the viewer hear a last-minute note given to Conan about someone named Philip. Not to mention him, because it's been a year since something happened. The entire series is about the juxtaposition of a modern idealized life and reality. Everyone perceives Jeff as weak, and it's not because he's a nice guy, it's because he uses positivity as escapism. When he's confronted with direct bullying, he uses soft deflection and turns bad thoughts into good thought. He has a genuine naivete that is associated with Mr. Rogers, but isn't actually what the real Mr. Rogers was like. While the show has inspirations from Mr. Rogers, Jeff Pickles is Jim Carrey. Mr. Rogers was very aware of a lot of things and was very careful about how he spoke. He knew how to speak to children and how to speak to adults. Jeff Pickles is a child in a grown man's body who was very sheltered and stifled. His show and his life is an expression of an idea of something he was told it should look like. Mr. Rogers did use his art to express different parts of himself, but he didn't suddenly discover the concept of death, nor did he feel the need to use children as a direct coping mechanism for what he didn't understand. Mr. Rogers was a true teacher who used positivity as a foundation to navigate complex emotions for children and adults. Jeff Pickles, Jim Carrey, is eternally a student who uses positivity as a retreat from complexity. He uses his very basic understanding to create rules and to navigate through his life. He believes what happened to his son and his family has to have a greater meaning, because he understands that we are all part of something bigger than us. But his mistake, like so many others, is believing that the meaning you assign to something is the only meaning that can exist. His belief is that life is meaningless without purpose. His mistake is not realizing he himself is a victim of neglect, is not letting himself feel his emotions, and misconstrues meaning for your individual emotional attachment and reaction to something. People easily fall into the autopilot trap of believing they can have better control over themselves and their emotions through meaning. If a situation or person means nothing to you, that means you don't have to feel anything about it or for them. But that's simply wrong, feeds into toxic individualism, and disempowers the person who believes that. If you realize yourself as a true individual, your capacity to give properly will never fall short. Simply put, things have meaning whether or not you decide to participate. All you're doing is silencing yourself in situations where your voice should be heard, becoming ill-prepared for moments you will be needed, and providing a platform for negativity. Life has meaning. People's purposes change through life, and one of the most underrated forms of theft I see affecting millions is energy. You probably thought I'd say time. Time is a close second, but you can have all the time in the world. If you don't feel up to doing anything, if it's not safe to say anything, if you're physically or mentally feel distraught, you may as well not have any time. You may not even want to have any more time. If you don't have the energy to save yourself, if no one has the energy to save you, let alone themselves, nothing gets done beyond evil. Jeff's father is the show's producer, which puts his dad in a very literal position of control over his life. Every idea has to go through him and be approved. This is how a lot of dads act towards their sons anyway, so why does he need the extra permission? Jeff is always fighting for his father's approval and permission. Everything he does is centered around rebelling against his dad. Jeff's sister Deirdre also works on the show. She's the outsider from the inside. In her own words, she is raising her daughter by doing the opposite of what the show teaches, also rebelling against her father. Deirdre is experiencing the exact same emotions as her brother, but through a different channel. She has been in the background and is becoming more active outside of her family life, triggered by the circumstances moving outside of her control. Where Jeff is retreating more into himself since everything outside is falling apart, Deirdre is becoming more vocal. They are both becoming more present. They are both trying to go where they feel needed, where they both want to be needed. Deirdre as a name means broken-hearted, sorrowful, wanderer, daughter. She threw herself into the negativity as a child and, in her own words, tried to protect Jeff from everything she could. This carries on through the enablement of Jeff and eventually her husband and daughter. Her daughter takes on all of the emotional weight that Deirdre and her husband avoid, masking it as independence. Deirdre leaves little room for misinterpretation about her situation as she lays out exactly how she feels in episode 7 of the first season. She hides from herself and chose to be with someone who does the same. We find out that it was never her idea to have kids. She realized her whole life has been centered around protecting and serving the men in her life, believing she contributed to the entirety, and that she was respected for it. But the reality is that she was used as a tool, and that is emphasized by her cheating husband's double standards and hypocrisy. When she becomes involved with Pickle's son, her husband doesn't give her half the sympathy or understanding she gives to him after catching him cheating with another man. Her husband becomes very vindictive and happily cruel. The healing only begins by jumping into the other extreme. Mothers and caretakers are very familiar with experiencing the extreme highs and lows of a situation before reaching a happy middle. While her eventual decision to trade custody of her daughter for the rights back to her puppets will have consequences of their own, those are ones she sees as better to deal with than continuing to put herself last. She says she made her choice based on what her father taught her to sacrifice, rightfully bitter upon realizing that her father sacrificed her, but recognizing she is a better mother from afar. When she was younger, she had a choice to move to Japan for a year to study. She rejected it at the last second out of fear and out of love for her family. Jeff coming to her with the idea for his show gave her an immediate sense of hope and purpose that she followed. It's not until she lost everything that she felt free enough to pick up where she left off all those years ago. What's sad about that is that she was always the puppet's sole creator. She could have continued her education and planned with Jeff and her father to use what she learned to keep improving the show, but remained in a well of stagnation. By shedding the identities of expectation, being a wife and mother, she is able to confront a more authentic version of her identity. Their father, Seb, although portrayed to be a fun guy, overall very understanding and even sweet, had prioritized the image of success overall. He has taught the kids escapist positivity. By avoiding all the negativity, he has taught them to lose touch with their authentic feelings and hindered their ability to process experiences fully. It teaches them to deflect deeper connections and discourages vulnerability. It leads to complacency and the paradox of tolerance. Standards are lost and nothing truly gets done. Seb is able to bring his foot down when the need arises, but most of the time he's a broken-hearted pushover that loses himself in people-pleasing if he can't maintain healthy boundaries. Your father was the first model of God. How your father acts will form and reinforce your beliefs about the world around you, whether you agree with him or not. You will believe what he believes, or believe something else, but nothing can change that was the first and primary exposure you had. It's unconscious. I talked about the neglect spiral in my last video, but if you notice, there's two ends to the spectrum. Let's explore what happens when the neglect isn't as obvious. We'll still start off in the middle, with a sensitive person who needs guidance and protection, who has gifts to develop and a desire to share them. When we're going the other way, this person's gifts are focused on and they are encouraged to develop them. Whether it's a talent, their looks, their intelligence, this becomes their identity. When a person's identity is based off of very few things, they become very shallow, no matter how deep their gift may be. They're actually preventing themselves from developing their gift in complex ways by revolving their identity around something like singing, acting, skating, or what have you. This can be fine when you're a child, still fresh to the world. This is where we get horse girls from. But remaining that confined as an adult will lead people into some very strange places, ones they rarely come back from. Now, I'm not saying getting fillers and injections makes you a bad person whatsoever. Our next level of descension into the spiral involves major, impulsive, and dangerous altercations, or simply ones that end up being regretted. If beauty is your thing, you'll think transformations like that is like committing to the next level, becoming ethereal, or more unified with some perfect ideal. If it's intelligence, you'll become more hostile and guarded around what you perceive as the truth over being confident with the knowledge you've attained, because you would have rarely put it into practice, or have been proven wrong with no recourse. If it's athletics, you may begin abusing steroids or seeing others as weak. The image and personality cultivated for yourself begins to break down behind the seams, and the seams begin to burst. Your thoughts may become more obsessive, compulsive, and there won't be any real point or goal you accomplish that isn't mainly devoted to curating this vision you have of perfection. Your identity becomes about being perfect, untouchable, ungovernable. This usually ends in a gruesome death, or a long life punctuated by strong moments of thoughtlessness. This is where the ends of the two extremes meet. We can see Jeff is a victim of that spiral. Jeff Pickles and Kanye West share many similarities. There's the inability to separate the self from the performance, fractured individuals with issues stemming before fame ever touched them, issues regarding the attempt of Christ-like forgiveness for early traumas caused by both mother and father. Grief has driven the majority of their work, consciously and subconsciously. They consider themselves victims of reality. They break down or rebel and are solely responsive in action. There's a fine line between having inspiration to create and responding the best way you can individually to being confined. What fuels this reaction to feeling confined is being misunderstood and downplayed, even disrespected by those criticizing their ideas offered. They're never treated the way they would treat others. There's no mirror for that side of the personality that has met them genuinely. Despite reaching celebrity status, these men are very lonely. That type of deep rejection wound ends up becoming the focus of these individuals. As long as they skirt around the issue and cannot healthily assign blame where it belongs, the worse inside they will feel. They hold on to the scraps of these emotions they have inside that are making them feel confused, angry, resolved to do something, and because this true part of themselves they avoid is so inherent to their identity, the people around them inevitably feel alienated. It's a sick cycle that they have to be strong enough to truly not care about the opinions of others and be a little cringe. Do something outside of what you started to expect for yourself. Why do you expect yourself to act this way? Jeff and Kanye feel extremely indebted to their legacies, and to their legacy they are simultaneously admirable and tragic. The relationship between Jeff and his ex-wife makes me think of Kim Kardashian and Kanye West. While he's performing his grief for an audience, doing everything but being present in the moment, she had to go through something horrific without him. Her sense of individuality is strong in a real way because she isn't allowing her grief or other emotions to dictate her life. She knew what she had and mourns her son, but he isn't an object to her. He doesn't mean something more or different to her in death. She cherished who he was as an individual regardless. Jeff blames her for this pain. Kanye and Jeff compromise their relationships through these actions: virtue signaling, idealism without balance, positivity at the expense of human connection, misguided or pathological altruism, moral overcompensation, moral masochism. Jeff mistakes humility for shame consistently, letting yourself or your family go without when you can afford it, or being very giving to those who are not directly connected to you when your direct loved ones are suffering. is not morally upright. It is abuse and neglect. Jeff bought the house next to his family so he could be close to them. But not only is he hardly there anyway, he is just not mentally present. He comes off very aggressive and threatening to his wife's new love interest. Jeff fails himself and excuses those failures through never leaving his comfort zone and saying, "That's just your perception of me." The reality is that he has no guardrails against corruption, no balance between practical and emotional needs. The balance between responsibility and joy isn't respected. Altruism becomes a tool for punishment of desire and a source of survivor's guilt. We learn that although Jeff is upset over having little control regarding his show, he asked for that. Jeff's one rule when he asked his dad for help getting the show established and airing was, as long as we give most of our proceeds to charity, Dad makes most of the decisions. His refusal to help himself or those closest to him reflects his own discomfort with success, privilege, or even happiness. Jeff also has an overdeveloped sense of duty, which isn't a bad thing if it's not paired with a martyr complex. Jeff focuses on his sacrifices being for the greater good, even the death of his son. Nobody asked him to do that. It's a trauma response and a coping mechanism more than it is genuine acts of altruism. You see this a lot in religious families, especially if the parent is a figurehead to the church. There's a phrase that goes, "The shoemaker's family goes barefoot." This means that those closest to the source are least likely to benefit from their expertise. These people do not realize they are the first person they are neglecting. They do not realize that they are not prioritizing peace and individuality. They don't feel comfortable if their family has an identity outside of their shadows, expressing regret for the problems that caused their separation, but making decisions that alienate them even further. Jeff and Kanye believe that they have been abandoned and interpret the self-preserving actions of others as betrayal. They're making the mistake of seeing in themselves as an untouchable archetype, thereby believing everything they do is what a protector does, what a father does, what Christ would have done. They do not see the role they play as adults making decisions, yet are bewildered and angry at the respect their ex-wives give their new partners. The dynamic gives a real-time perspective of what it's like being with someone whose sense of self is tied to their public persona, creative visions, or grand ideals. Jill and Kim open themselves to new experiences while they're healing, prioritizing the future and deciding what they want their individual lives to look like. Both women hesitant to settle down with the partner they found after ending a very public relationship. Both men don't realize the value of stability and safety that prioritizing correctly affords. They're trapped in cycles of regret and emotional immaturity. For these kinds of relationships to work, there needs to be respect for the individual beyond their persona, and a balance between love and ambition. The way Jeff attempts to move on is a trauma response. I had always wondered what would have happened in Fight Club if the narrator decided to have sex with a cancer patient. We get that answer with Jeff deciding to date Vivian. The physical representations of toxic positivity exist in that, and when Jeff reveals to his son he pays for the man who killed Phil to live. He pays for his daughter too. He says, "Hate doesn't punish who you think it does." Then he is given heavy doses of reality from his ex-wife, who ends up saying something mean after being disappointed for so long. It's not fair that their family had to fall apart and be destroyed for their son to receive something luxurious. It's not fair to neglect your family in the most vulnerable and prime seasons of your relationship with them in the name of some vague pseudo-philosophic religious ideal while tending to everyone else's. Through his love for the dying woman, his grief for his past, his realizations about himself, he becomes more self-aware. He desires respect. He tells Vivian, "I don't know why I act the way I do, but inside I'm very angry." He shows this side to his ex-wife's boyfriend, his kid's friend who asks him if he's ever killed people, and shows it again to Vivian at dinner. Because he's never processed any negativity, he doesn't recognize these instances as being abusive and toxic. Inside, he's nothing like what he portrays. His first reaction is anger, and instead of recognizing it and being allowed to process it and come up with a dignified and personal solution, like Mr. Rogers did, he constructed a false reality that promotes the image of happiness, one that he doesn't really relate with. This is especially true when he offers ideas of his own that are constantly rejected or tweaked by his father. Jeff's intuition tells him that his dad is already planning on phasing him out and replacing him. He relates to Vivian because he feels like he is dying too, but he's using her temperance as another escape from his evolution into true adulthood. However, he simultaneously is so inspired to comfort her through her death and to make her feel special that the death episode he started to dream of is made real through her. This is called grief displacement. He was drawn to a terminally ill woman by the need to process mortality and death on his own terms. He doesn't relate to her romantically. He relates to her through an emotional struggle. He desperately wants the comfort of his mother, and he will never get that because not only did she walk out on him and the family, she is diagnosed with a degenerative brain disease and doesn't remember him at all. While Jeff isn't the one to end things, it still feels emotionally shallow on his side of things. He still sees her as an object and expects her to be a certain way after experiencing remission. It was never about who she was, but about what she was experiencing in her moment of vulnerability. It highlights Jeff's passivity, lack of agency, and comfort with transactional or role-based fantasies over an authentic connection. And he is secretly relieved when she leaves. It reminds me of the Family Guy episode where Brian dates a woman who ends up recovering from cancer and isn't able to fulfill this role he created for himself as a hero. She decides to move on. He is stuck with Viva Los Pages. This further underscores that charity is a trauma response for him. He has a fascination with healing evil and finding the best in others who show their worst when he should be nurturing the victims. He is obsessed with minimizing his problems and treating them like distractions. He has a huge safety net, and he himself is also seen as an object. He doesn't understand that in a day-to-day living basis, he is an abuser who has more in common with the mental state of a criminal than a nurturer. He thinks he's being honest, but he's being a bully. The season alludes to a breakdown throughout, and he ultimately shows this is true in the last episode of the first season. A man purposely running over his ex-wife's new boyfriend, then making Christmas breakfast and trying to open presents together like nothing happened, already sounds like part 1 of a Netflix docu-series about marriages gone wrong. Throw in fooling their son and her into thinking it was an accident, and only confessing to alleviate the guilt brought on by volunteering your own liver transplant. Just so somehow you're not a hypocrite in your own mind. That's probably just frosting on a lemon, right? His sister enables him, saying nobody saw it coming and he's such a great guy. I'm just gonna bring up the BoJack comparison again by pointing out Jeff's father, Seb, comparing Jeff to Secretariat. There's a strong and direct Santa Claus comparison that persists through the first season that culminates in Jeff running over Peter purposefully on Christmas. This is Jeff's reaction to being offered pot by Peter. On a surface level. Under the iceberg, Jeff is directly attacking the representation of his failure. He feels replaced at work, at home, and by his only living son. This is what happens when complex people try to remain one-dimensional. Their second dimension becomes pain and anger, and they feel okay taking that out on others. Jeff is an emotionally manipulative person who had only showed up to try to take his ex-wife on a little date. Peter is closer to a modern Mr. Rogers than Jeff is in looks and personality. Peter is closer to a modern Santa than Jeff is. Peter even forgives Jeff afterwards in a genuine way, while Jeff eventually proves he pretends to like and accept Peter after giving him an organ. He is trusted enough to be told about the marriage proposal and ruined it all the ways he could. He blames Jill for the death of their son and can't let her move on, but is very forgiving of his own mother for abandoning him. In a way, Jeff is also attacking the idea of who he's been pressured to be his whole life. In this world, there doesn't seem to be a comparable figure to Jeff besides Santa or, eventually, Jesus. There's a weird Santa to Jesus escalation that happens with the introduction of the Jeff I am listening toys. The prophet to Jesus to God pipeline of a cult leader becomes ominously present. A cult leader is 3 things: enabled, persistent, and convinced they are right. Even a well-meaning figure, when consumed by pain and a need for control, can become manipulative or cult-like. The I'm Listening doll reflects Jeff's desire for deep connections, but it's overshadowed by his inability to set boundaries. The lines between Mr. Pickles and Jeff get even more blurred. It turns empathy into a product, turns him physically ever-present, messianic. The popularity of the doll, and even the criticism, fuels his ego and justifies his need to heal others over a reasonable moral boundary. Like a cult leader, his charisma and image make people orbit him, project hopes onto him, view him as infallible. He genuinely believes he's responsible for fixing everyone's problems, and is fine being seen as the sole salvation. The emotional connection offered is fake. Only his audience is being openly vulnerable. His vulnerability is manufactured. This is not including the fact that it's impressionable young children he is targeting. When the illusion is finally shattered by the attack on Jeff's family, it forces him to accept that well-meaning intentions have unintended and sometimes deadly consequences. The cult-like trajectory and culmination of it is a manifestation of the dangers of Jeff's unbridled influence. The devotion farmed from these people quickly turns to hate when they feel betrayed or unheard. Some people exist to be pure reflections of evil in this world. The man who attacks the Pickles home is a reflection of the resentment that Jeff feels towards Jill, Peter, his son, himself, and his mother. Jeff's mom leaving them is shown in the very first season, but in the second is centered on more as the catalyst for why Jeff is the way he is, because he was abandoned by his mom and tried to lie to himself to make the best of the situation. That became his trauma response. He made his sister happy and his dad happy. He had the idea to try to make the world happy with his puppets and songs. They helped create the world he envisioned and shielded him from reality until it became unavoidable for him. And they still try regardless because he's the closest thing to their mother they'll ever get back. The mother issues are very focused on and prominent. One person points out that there are no mother characters on the show and says the water must symbolize the mom. Jeff admits he lost his virginity to a woman in her 60s. He puts his relationship with Jill on a complete standstill because he's afraid of making her a mother and having her be the main woman in his life. He's afraid of her leaving like his mother did. But that doesn't change the fact that it does. And it will, no matter how close he lets himself get. He's afraid of her leaving like his mother did, but that doesn't change the fact that it does hurt. And it will hurt, no matter how close he lets himself get. It's better to have the memories of a life well spent, and even if your memories end up going, the impact you had on others remains true. While his son desires to go back in time, Jeff does in a more literal sense by retreating to a facility for people with Alzheimer's or other degenerative conditions. It's revealed to us late in the second season that Jeff knew where his mother ended up, presumably the whole time. He is the only one who knows. This could be because he's protecting his family from the pain, but it's also him keeping his mother to himself. Jill does the same thing by keeping Phil's organ donations a secret. Between the both of them, it's a desire to keep control in their lives, not upset the person they see as in charge, and perpetuates the pattern of avoiding tough mental conflicts and assuming a role. It suppresses the pain instead of addressing it. These emotions are where a lot of toxic individuality stems from, and we see how avoiding the root of their individual sources of pain creates a scar in their lives that simply makes them act differently. To live authentically with emotional wounds is an act people get punished for, and that makes it so hard for them to truly admit they're not perfect. Jeff is taught about the concept of a compassionate lie. In this case, you're not deciding someone's reality for them, you're responding to their clear level of understanding and ability to absorb and accept reality. A child is like a dementia patient that can get better. They start off completely clueless and in total need of guidance, and you can slowly introduce reality to them as they experience it for themselves. You don't waste time insisting or correcting their confusion. You affirm their beliefs or redirect the conversation towards something else in a soothing way. People neglect children by using the truth as power over them, introducing them to traumas and leaving them to suffer alone with them. Power corrupts untrained minds, old or new. Jeff's entire job is introducing sanitized and comforting narratives to children. So in this realm where he never has to worry about the eventuality of growth, he excels. We were never lied to by anyone as kids. We were simply neglected by the people whose job it was to really teach us. Jeff's job is to teach kids and care for them, but it's only from a distance. It is shallow, and that's usually all we get. There's a saying that goes, your mother is a bus driver that brings you into the world, helps guide you, and drops you off where you need to be. Jeff waits with his mother at the bus stop where metaphorically she is now just another passenger, waiting to be taken to her next phase of life, which is death. There are a ridiculous amount of double standards throughout the show. Double standards undermine relationships and influence people like Jeff to live up to an image or rebel against it, never truly being themselves. As we mentioned before, Dee Dee's ex-husband becomes vicious towards her, unwilling to confront his own guilt and endlessly forgiving towards himself. His actions are justifiable, hers are a betrayal. He has the inability to empathize, where she is actually expected to be a channel for everyone else's emotions. She is seen as combative and irrational when she struggles to maintain composure. In this show, emotional vulnerability is seen as a strength in men and a weakness in women multiple times over. The role of parenthood is seen as secondary to every adult in Jeff's family. While it's good not to make your identity about solely being a parent, they make it clear it's a part of themselves they reject. Everyone's primary role is to be some puppet at the hands of whoever is there in the moment. Jeff is constantly forgiven for acts of pure evil simply because he's not open with his dark side. There's a semblance between him and Homelander from The Boys. The first person Jeff publicly freaked out on was someone he was defending his son from. Nobody watching knows about Jeff's other acts of evil on less deserving targets, and in his mind, he is justified and sees it as a reset button for his image. Fame and the image he spent years cultivating got him away with multiple attempts of murder. Jeff cannot provide stability. He relied heavily on Jill during their marriage to make that happen, and still does after their separation. If Jeff did the same things he does with a nasty attitude or with a cigarette or drink or a woman in his hand, then he would be seen as bad. But it's with a smile, so it's always a happy little accident. But Jill, who lives in reality, is always left being looked down upon in comparison. A prime example of his hypocrisy is his emphasis on celibacy, abstinence from drinking and drugs, and dislike for foul language. It leads to a rebellion of the international pickle people, who are scared that the words Jeff puts in their mouth will get them killed. The Mr. Pickles identity, especially after the failure of the I'm Listening doll, celebrates empathy and commodifies the human experience of connection, while dehumanizing those same feelings. Again, Jill is the most vocal about the reality and keeps begging Jeff to face it with her. While she herself isn't based on any one particular person, she serves as a perfect archetype of the modern divorcee. Women initiate divorce more often for many reasons, but one that's getting some more attention is the fact that they desire complex relationships while their partners are emotionally unavailable and absorbed in their own world. Jill has to maintain stability in her family while dealing with her grief and her emotional needs in the healthiest way she can, because she recognizes now at least one person needs to be a conscious role model for their son. Men like Jeff are allowed to retreat into their pain, make spectacles out of it, and never take it seriously, while women like Jill are left to manage the practical and emotional consequences by themselves. Jill struggles with finding a new identity for herself and ultimately is able to let go of a lot of the ideas she has about herself by confronting head-on the idea that she holds blame for her son's death. Jeff rejects blame and responsibility and passes it around out of fear, but Jill is a consistent representation of bravery by admitting that blame and responsibility makes her an important person and gives her purpose. By knowing where she holds blame and responsibility, her life is given a deeper meaning that she wholeheartedly accepts. This is something Jeff's mom, Louise, rejected. Jeff's mom is very cruel speaking about her children. She believes he's still young, so that was how she felt when she left them. Jeff refuses to believe she really means it, but they're the same. They both say evil things with a smile so no one knows they're serious. Jeff silently reconnecting with his mother and resenting Jill for loving him is yet another example of his hypocrisy. He is interested in putting the effort towards pity and excuses of others before his chosen family. It would be perfectly possible to do both. It is Jeff who has shown through his values and actions where his heart and intentions lie. For example, because he was resentful of his wife, he chose to secretly tend to the man who accidentally killed Phil over his injured wife and remaining child. With his wealth, he could have easily chosen both if that's where his heart was. At the end of the second season, we see Jeff face to face with himself. The evil man who tries to burn down the Pickles house attempts to kidnap Will, with God knows what intentions. Jeff beats him mercilessly, thoroughly rejecting the side of himself that comes through despite his best intentions. The kidnapper thinks he has the best intentions, too. Especially compared to Jeff. Jeff is forced to admit intentions don't matter, and he must draw a hard line. Either he can tolerate everyone and every crime has a meaning, or child predators deserve more than a calm me down breath. Actions speak louder than words. Consequences are real, and some things can never be replaced. The best way to work through the cynicism that comes with heavy acceptances and the feeling of weakness is to balance it with the search for true meaning and authenticity, holding on to hope and compassion, while rediscovering the meaning of true love. We spend so much time preparing for loss or avoiding it altogether that we don't spend time or treat our loved ones like we need to. I found that kidding provides a careful deconstruction. It provides a meditation on finding your place in the shards of a broken world. The heart is a great compass, and you can be a wonderful orienteer.